The topic of today's video, the French cruiser Algerie, is an interesting case. And not just because there's very little written about this ship. Algerie is interesting because she is a common answer for the question, what is the best treaty cruiser? The kind of question that will get a ton of arguing. Algerie, New Orleans, Zara, it's not an easy question to answer. Nonetheless, Algerie was a very capable ship, in theory. Unfortunately, as we'll see in this video, she didn't get the chance to show that. The cruiser would have a quiet peacetime career, and when conflict did come, in late 1939, Algerie suffered. Not from damage, but from being part of the Vichy fleet, leaving the ship stuck in port until being scuttled relatively early on. But, of course, that comes later. First, let's talk design. To understand Algerie, it's important to understand the French Navy of the time, their heavy cruiser force in particular. As Algerie was being designed, this consisted of 6 ships, 2 Duquesne class dating back to 1924, and the 4 Suffren class begun in 1926, very early as Washington Treaty designs go. This meant the French had an early start, but it also meant the Italians could design against those ships. For now, however, a brief overview. The early French heavy cruisers began their lives as light cruisers. Their main battery was admittedly impressive at 8 203mm or 8-inch guns. However, in the interest of speed, the French sacrificed armor protection, to the point on Duquesne where the ships might as well have been unarmored. A 30mm, 1.2-inch armored box over the magazine. Suffren would improve this to 50mm or 2 inches, but that was still very thin. This lack of armor is why they were designated light cruisers, at least as designed. The same sort of thing that happened with Pensacola and Northampton in the United States, except those ships, for all their supposed light protection, were far better armored. In any case, this design choice left the French in a bit of a bind. The Italians would build the Trento class as a counter to Duquesne, with a 70mm thick belt. This is what led to Suffren improving armor at the cost of some speed. And then, while these ships were entering service, the Italians went a step further. The Zara class, which gave up on extreme speed in favor of very heavy armor, for a cruiser of the time period, of course. All of this work, from Duquesne to Zara, took around 5 years, a good example of how fast naval technology developed in the 1920s. The first French heavy cruisers were entering service in 1929, the same year the Zaras were laid down. This fast pace of construction had arguably bitten the French a bit because their cruisers were outmatched in everything but speed, and perhaps firepower. The French and Italian cruisers both had 8 203mm guns each, although one can argue back and forth on which model was superior. Regardless, with the advent of the Zara class, the French pivoted in design. They followed the Italians and designed a new cruiser with a much greater focus on armor. Instead of going for raw speed, this new ship would be a balanced design, while still holding to the 10,000-ton Washington limit. The armored box design was ditched in favor of a traditional main belt, with the thickness increased quite a bit at the same time. Not quite to the level of Zara, but still a notable improvement. Furthermore, the deck was quite thick for a cruiser. Even the turrets had decent protection. This did, of course, come at the cost of speed, a cost the French were willing to pay to get a better ship. That ship became Algerie. Let's look at what the French got out of this change in focus. Displacing around 10,100 tons at standard loading, Algerie held to the treaty limit. This displacement rose to around 13,700 tons at the full load, which is still lighter than Zara. As for main firepower, This was the same as the previous designs. 8 203mm guns in 4 twin turrets, 2 super firing on the bow and 2 super firing on the stern. Nothing particularly special there. The secondary battery, on the other hand, was enhanced to 12 100mm 3.9-inch guns in 6 twin turrets, 3 to a side around the superstructure, supported in turn by 4 37mm anti-aircraft guns and 16 13.2mm machine guns. The ship would pick up more machine guns and 37mm cannon over the course of her career. To round off the weaponry, Algerie also carried 6 torpedo tubes, in 2 triple mounts, one on either side of the ship. Now with that done, we can look at the main selling point of this design. That, of course, being the armor protection. This consisted of a main belt that reached 110mm, or 4.3 inches in thickness. The deck, for its part, ranged from 30mm to 80mm, or 3.1 inches in thickness. As I said earlier, even the turrets were improved, with 100mm turret faces and 70mm sides. Furthermore, Algerie had proper underwater protection, a combination of free flooding spaces and fuel bunkers similar to battleships of the time. As mentioned before, this did come at the cost of speed. Algerie could manage around 31 knots on 84,000 horsepower, through 4 shafts in this case. And with all of that covered, we finished the design stage. So why is this ship considered the best treaty cruiser? Well, it often comes down to Algerie being the best balanced. There are no glaring issues. The ship also held to the tonnage restrictions. Algerie doesn't excel in most respects, but she also doesn't fail. Again, this is a point that can be argued. Either way, we're done with the design. Now we can talk service history, such as it is. I'll say before I begin that there is very little written on this ship's career, at least in English language sources. This goes double for the initial peacetime service. Even French Cruisers, 1922 to 1956, has very little on this period. Either way, Algerie's story began on March 19th, 1931. The ship was laid down on that day in Brest. Her construction would then go fairly quickly, with Algerie launched on May 21st, 1932. The fitting out process would be a bit slower, with the ship only commissioned on June 15, 1934, after which the cruiser was almost immediately assigned to the Mediterranean. All of the French heavy cruisers were assigned here as a direct counter to Italy. From what I've been able to gather, Algerie would spend the entirety of the 1930s in this area, primarily operating on the usual peacetime duty: training cruises, fleet reviews, and port visits. French Cruisers makes mention, for example, of visiting both Venice and Naples. This was in the summer of 1935, soon after Algerie entered service, and before French and Italian relations had completely fallen apart. During this period, Algerie was flagship of the 1st Cruiser Division, a group she would remain in through to 1939. The only major incident of note that I can find is a brief reference to a collision with Colbert. This happened in 1936, evidently, but I don't have an actual date. It's a one-line reference in relation to an August 1936 refit in the aforementioned French cruiser book. Algerie also probably served on non-intervention patrol during the Spanish Civil War. Most European cruisers did at some point or another, and we have a picture dated to 1937 with the striped turret indicative of that duty. However, I can't say with absolute certainty that she did. Beyond this, unfortunately, there's not much I've been able to find. Maybe French language sources are better, and if anyone has suggestions there, put it in the comments. I would have to rely on machine translation, but I would love more information on the interwar period. In any event, as we reach 1939, we also reached the limited wartime service. The first notable event during this period was being based at Dakar. From October 14th, 1939 through to January of 1940, Algerie was part of Force X. This group was intended to hunt down German surface raiders, including the elusive Graf Spee, and would, in fact, sortie several times to try and track down German shipping. However, Algerie would fail to find anything during this period. Her sorties gave the crew experience, but ultimately came to nothing. So, after being replaced on this duty, the cruiser sailed back to France. A short refit in Toulon followed before her second major mission came in March of 1940, for a certain value of major mission. In this case, it involved escorting French gold to Canada. These were payments for American military aid, and it was an important mission, just not an exciting one. The real excitement came soon after, when Italy declared war on France. This came on June 10th, 1940, and saw Algerie back in the Mediterranean. As it would turn out, though, she didn't get to fight her intended enemy. There was no cruiser duel between France and Italy. Instead, Algerie's only taste of real combat came in bombarding Genoa. 4 days after Italy entered the war, on June 14th, Algerie joined other French ships in hitting the Italian coast. The bombardment was successful in regard to doing damage. However, the actual shelling proved to be fairly inaccurate, and the damage was pretty minor. At the same time, the French weren't damaged at all. The Italians sent several attacks by torpedo boats, but those failed to hit the French. After this, all Algerie did before the French surrender on June 22, 1940, was escort a convoy. This had the benefit of keeping her out of Mers el-Kabir. In fact, Algerie would be in Toulon when the British attacked the French fleet. This was fortunate in that Algerie escaped damage. However, it also meant that she would be stuck in Toulon. The cruiser never had the chance to join the Free French forces, so she would remain in port with minor refits for the rest of her career, with the exception of escorting the damaged battleship Provence back to France in November 1940, and possibly a training cruise here or there. Because of this, Algerie was in Toulon when the French fleet was scuttled on November 27, 1942. Explosive charges were placed in her guns, and her valves were opened. The explosions wrecked the ship and set fires that burned until December 16th of 1942. The damage from this was so severe that the ship was written off. Even the Italians, desperate for new ships, didn't see any sense in repair work. They would cut up the cruiser and raise the individual sections in March of 1943. However, with the Italian surrender, even that work came to a halt, which resulted in the remnants of Algerie being sunk a second time by an Allied bombing raid on March 7, 1944. Whatever was left of the ship at this point was left in place, until being raised again and broken up in 1949. A sad fate for a theoretically quite capable ship, but at the same time, an expected one for the French fleet of the time. Many ships would suffer similar fates, unfortunately. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.